Conflict in relationships is unavoidable. Jesus offers a solution. Conflict in relationships is inevitable. Even with friends and family, keeping the peace can be challenging. And it becomes even tougher when dealing with adversaries, those who wish us harm. This has been true throughout human history. Wherever people gather, conflict and violence often follow. This was especially evident in Jesus' time when Roman forces occupied Israel. In response, Jesus presented a way to help his followers pursue peace and mend even the most strained relationships. Jesus believed that God's wisdom for relationships was embedded in the covenant laws given to Israel. So, in his teachings, Jesus would reference these laws and then reveal the deeper wisdom they contain. For example, Jesus says, "Do not break your oath but fulfill the vows you've made to the Lord." An oath was a serious promise made before God to uphold one's word. Like if I needed to borrow money, I could swear by God to repay it. You could trust me because God commanded that I keep my promises. Oaths seem like a good way to avoid disputes. You'd think so, but even oaths could be manipulated. For instance, what if I swore by God's temple that I'd repay you? But I didn't swear by God directly, just by his temple. So, technically I'm not bound by the oath. And Jesus puts a stop to this by saying, don't swear oaths at all, whether by God or anything else in creation. So, never make promises? Not exactly. Jesus' point is that we shouldn't use God's name as a tool to manipulate others. He says, let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Being a peacemaker begins with an unwavering commitment to honesty and integrity. But what about when someone else wrongs me? That's covered in Jesus' next example. He refers to the Torah, saying, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." This is known as the Law of Retaliation. Yeah, it seems like permission to seek revenge. If you hurt me, I can hurt you. Actually, the law was intended to limit retaliation, ensuring the response matched the harm done and went no further. So this law aimed to keep peace by controlling our instinct for revenge. Yes, and Jesus builds on this, telling his followers, don't repay evil with evil, don't retaliate at all. Correct. Instead, Jesus calls his followers to value peace over revenge, but letting someone get away with wrongdoing won't lead to peace. You can't just do nothing. True, but Jesus doesn't advocate passivity. Instead, he encourages bold, creative, nonviolent responses to evil, which can open the door to peace. What would that look like? Jesus offers 3 examples from his time. First, Jesus says, if someone sues you for your shirt, give them your coat too. In ancient Israel, taking someone's coat was illegal as it served as a blanket for warmth, but someone could exploit the law by suing for their shirt instead. So Jesus suggests a surprising response: give them both your shirt and your coat. Wouldn't that leave you vulnerable? Jesus is using this as a striking gesture to expose the injustice through extreme generosity. Then Jesus adds, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, walk 2. In his time, Roman soldiers could legally force people to carry their gear for a mile. How degrading. Jesus responds by suggesting they walk an extra mile voluntarily. While the first mile treats you like a servant, the second shows you are choosing to help, asserting your humanity. So, Jesus says to treat even an enemy like a friend? Yes, it sounds radical, but he believes that bold generosity can dismantle the power structures of the world and potentially turn enemies into allies. This brings us to the final teaching. As is normally said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Here, Jesus was quoting the biblical command to love your neighbor, but the addition of hating your enemy was a common cultural interpretation. Jesus counters with, love your enemies and pray for those who mistreat you. Isn't that a bit much? Making peace is one thing, but loving my enemies? It's challenging, but Jesus insists that real peace is only possible when we recognize the inherent value in every person, even our enemies, because they too bear the image of God. But how can I love someone who hates me? It's already hard enough to love the people close to me. That's true, and loving friends and family is a good thing, but for Jesus, that's just the starting point. He calls his followers to extend that same love beyond their comfort zones, modeling God's boundless and generous love. Jesus says, God causes the sun to rise on the good and the evil, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. The goal is to be peacemakers, inviting others in and working to restore broken relationships in our communities. It's a radical way of living. Yes, it is, and Jesus calls it becoming complete when he says, Be ye complete, just as your heavenly Father is complete. He's inviting us to imitate God's generosity toward both friends and enemies. For Jesus, only through creative love can true peace be found. We've now explored Jesus' teachings on managing difficult relationships. What are your thoughts on how to manage conflict in our everyday settings? How will you handle a situation in which a loved and trusted person wrongs you? Let's get talking. Please subscribe to the channel